Hi, welcome back. This is the Formative Assessment Podcast. This is podcast number 10. We've worked through the practice and the theory and the practice of formative assessment, and we've worked up to curriculum. We've talked about the classroom, we talked about curriculum, we talked about assessment last time, learning to love assessment, and that takes us to the idea of formative assessment as a model for leadership, and leadership in particular for learning. And what I'm going to do is kind of consolidate a lot of the thinking we've done in these podcasts and go to a book of Dylan Wiliam that isn't really discussed very much, which I don't know why. It's excellent, which is about leadership and using formative assessment in leadership. Leadership is a really banal topic, and there's completely, hundreds of books and platitudes and all sorts of things that are said about leadership and leadership theory. And I've stripped this back so much because I don't want to bog you down in a lot of that. I really want to focus in on a few things. And they're on this first slide, that teaching itself is a form of leadership, that what we're doing in the classroom is leading students, and all teachers need to think of themselves as leaders and part of what they do as leadership. And part of the politics of what I've been doing in these podcasts is getting you leaders and teachers to think about how teachers need to seize back their professional identity in terms of, and pedagogy, curriculum development, assessment literacy, all of these as areas where we can sort of take control of what it means to be a professional teacher. And, I've talked a little bit about, and I'm happy to talk more another time about how that's been attacked, but I think anyone in the profession understands that. Moving from teachers to leaders, I've been trying to articulate what a vision of learning could be, using formative assessment as the kind of core paradigm. And for leaders to be effective, they need, particularly for creating a culture of learning, they need to have an ironclad vision for what learning looks like. Maybe not ironclad, it's got to be maneuverable, but it needs to be defined. And why it doesn't need to be ironclad is it has to be open to adapting to your particular culture. And it needs to be not intuitive or based on our own biases, but be evidence informed and pedagogy and theory informed as well. And it's important to think about the importance of theory and evidence in informing our understanding. And then I flip it to really look at leadership itself is actually a form of teaching. So if teaching is a form of leadership, leadership is actually teaching. And when we talk about leadership in schools, we should think about very much the importance of leaders who have actually been in the classroom and understand what it is that the project of teaching and education looks like, because it isn't just any other business. And on this slide, I have two paintings by David. I have, here we have Napoleon. Look at the madness of that horse. Look at the eyes, terrifies me. And the absolute calm, kind of regal way he's pointing in the direction of travel. And then we have the kind of patron saint of teachers, poor Socrates, just about to drink the hemlock, pointing in another direction up to where the forms are. This is Plato's Socrates, of course, where the forms are, where the truth lay. And there the teachers are, the students are lamenting him being persecuted and about to kill himself. Now, I don't know what I'm saying about this, whether we are teachers who are trying to emulate ourselves and destroy ourselves for our students, or leaders who are doing that, or if we can very peacefully, very clearly, out in front, point to the path. But anyway, I just thought these two paintings, they evoke in me this topic. Okay, so moving on. So this is the book that I feel isn't discussed very much, but should be, because Dylan Wiliam is not only a remarkable scholar and speaker on formative assessment, but he's with real patience, he's written a book on leading and teacher training. And he opens this book with this amazing kind of myth. I'd invite you to read it, but he basically says, he gives a story and where these mythical giants kind of lay down their bodies so that their armies can cross over their actual physical bodies. And he says this is a really good parable for leadership, because one that would be a leader must be a bridge. So he really straight out says the main job of school leaders is to improve the work performance of those they lead. And you could say that about any leader, but if that's the case, work performance is about teaching and learning. And that should be the number one job of leadership, he argues. And I will echo in this podcast. Other things that leaders do have plenty of impact on students. And this is the crucial thing about where research and theory kind of collide. The size of the impact is small in comparison to the impact of developing the classroom practice of teachers in those schools. Now, I am not a statistician. I am not an education or psychological theorist, and I cannot do the rigorous data analysis that Dylan Wiliam does, with the caveat that he is critical of research, the research ed movement, and over-reliance on teachers as researchers. He doesn't want to see that. But what he does want you to understand is there are things that, all things considered, are better to do in the classroom and worse things to do in the classroom. He also does note that everything works somewhere and nothing works everywhere. So another thing about teaching is, what do we suspect could possibly work? That's the experimental part of teaching. We have to be open to that. But really crucial is to think about is, what are we doing and what is the size of the impact? And he argues, and I think quite persuasively, that the number one thing that all leaders and teachers can do is improve the quality of teaching and learning. And that will have the number one impact on everything that goes on in a school. And I would argue that for all leaders, this is the principal book to go to. He argues in a kind of summary that if we're going to improve teacher quality, we're going to need quality teacher professional development. Elsewhere, he quotes this from Michael Fullan: "Nothing has promised so much and has been so frustratingly wasteful as the thousands of workshops that led to no significant change in practice when teachers returned to the classrooms." CPD is a highly problematic aspect of our profession, I would argue. And as someone who obviously reads a great deal and thinks about it and has committed himself to a lot of CPD, it's hard for me to say that, but it is true that you can be stimulated by a lot of ideas, but if it doesn't influence your practice, it's a lot of money, a lot of consultancy, a lot of ideas being spilled out that isn't actually having the impact that we want it to. And leaders need to take that seriously. And what they need to do is think about teacher professional development that has to address, this is Wiliam now, what teachers actually do in the classroom, how they change what they do in the classroom, so the habit change. It's really, I think he's very persuasive in this book in thinking about improving teaching is actually a discussion about changing habits. And of course, he argues that formative assessment plus teacher support is the main way you do this. And he argues, and you can go through the data, that it's really a point of high leverage, maybe uniquely high leverage in terms of cost and impact. And it's a kind of Trojan horse for wider issues of pedagogy, psychology, and curriculum, which I've tried to outline in these podcasts. And his solution is a product that the SSAT has done in collaboration with him. When I say product, Dylan Wiliam isn't someone who is marketing a certain thing. This product, which is a very cheap price point, it was done in collaboration with him and the SSAT. It's like £300, and it's about embedding formative assessment through teaching and learning communities over a 2-year process, and it's been externally verified by the EEF. Again, look at me do all this data stuff, but just as a way of saying, like, look, there's a real logic to what he's trying to assert can improve. You don't need this product, by the way. You just need to think about, how can I develop and establish a learning community in my school that is dedicated to improving practice and firmly focused on the aspect of formative assessment, because it's the most impactful. Now, if I could convince you of that, if I could convince every teacher and every leader of that, a great deal of my job is done. The resistance is that people aren't convinced, or that they position formative assessment with one of many innovations or strategies. And this podcast is going to challenge some of those notions. Okay, so from the Leadership for Learning group in Cambridge, this book came out this year, Reforming or Reinventing Schools. The authors lament, there's still no pedagogy in England, no theory of how to learn to teach or how to learn to teach better. And I really lament that, and it really annoys me a great deal. And that's probably one of the animus for these podcasts, is to say to you that there is a pedagogy, it is formative assessment. Agree or disagree, I think it should be engaged with. It needs to be engaged with beyond the tick box. If it's going to be embedded properly, you have to understand what it is that you're doing, where it comes from, and what it's based on. And there is actually something that we could all engage with to form a pedagogy for what it means to improve. And the second is from an absolutely excellent book called Professional Capital by Andy Hargreaves and Michael Fullan, two, I'd say, giants of educational leadership. They adapt a quotation from Nelson Mandela towards the end of their book. There can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats children, is Nelson Mandela's quote. And they add, and their teachers. And why they add that is because children aren't just treated by an empty, invisible agent. That teachers need to be recognized as professionals, need to be respected, need to be trained and listened to and acknowledged in order to become better at their jobs and to help facilitate the learning of students. And this is, I think this is an absolutely excellent book to celebrate teachers. And what I'm going to argue is that that's how you improve teaching, is not through Linda Darling Hamilton's idea of kick the dog harder way of educational reform, or punitive measures within your schools, but in fact, active trust, listening, motivation, and love for your teachers, support and love for your teachers, is how we're going to improve the education system as a whole. But in any given school or any given department, or ourselves as individuals, it's going to be through respect, love, and mutual support. Okay? So, this is where we begin for leaders. And I should say, remember, all teachers are leaders. If you don't know what good teaching looks like, how can you improve teachers? Remember, things like, I have complete scorn. I felt so empowered when I did a course with Dylan Wiliam, where he said he doesn't have any faith in Ofsted in judging the quality of teaching. And then he said he himself, the maestro, the master, watching a lesson, couldn't determine in one lesson if someone was a good teacher or not. It's not about evaluation in that sense. It's about, well, what is it that you want out of this? And you often can't tell off of one lesson. But conversely, if you don't have a model in your mind for what excellence looks like, how can you improve others? This is the bitterest pill, and this requires you, all of me, all of us, to go to the start of these podcasts again and study and think about what is it that makes good learning, and how will we articulate that common language. We have to come to some kind of agreement, and maybe it will be a very open field. It has to be articulated. And once it's agreed, then what we've got to think about is changing habits. And if we're going to change habits, the number one thing I think for leaders to become that bridge is for them to change them ourselves. We, all of us who lead in any capacity, whether in the classroom, in the department, in a faculty or whole school level, we have to change ourselves, our own habits, our own mentalities, and to model, but then to also help facilitate change for others. We as leaders then need to change our priorities, because we're spending time doing a lot of stuff, but some of the things we're doing, we should stop doing because there are other things we could be doing that are better. And how are we going to adjudicate over that? We're going to need evidence, we're going to need experimentation, and we're going to need to foster a culture of risk. That's going to mean changing our priorities and having the strength to measure our changes all the time, and be willing to change our opinion if we're shown to be wrong. What can we stop doing in order to do better things? That is the hardest question for a leader, because everything we do is important. And I love that Dylan Wiliam says that. Everything teachers do is important. Everything that leaders do is important. So what happens is when we want to make change, we put it on top of an enormous pile of things that we have to do. And that is untenable because time is limited, workload is excessive. So when we say, what can we stop doing? When he says that, and he wants to replace what we're doing, which is good, with things that are better. Okay? And what is better? Better isn't stuff that makes you feel good. Better is things that lead to greater learning for students. How do I know? Well, you don't know for sure, but there is some evidence that informs your decisions, and that you can't simply tell and expect teachers to be compliant unless you are in an environment like an academy or another kind of corporatist structure where the culture is one of complete compliance. Teachers have to be participants. They have to have a say in what this looks like. And leaders then become bridges between what is it that they want to occur and the bridge where we are and how leaders will get the community to where they want us to be. So what we're looking at today is how do we lead a culture of learning? And we've talked about, we've started by talking about leadership as this bridge. I'm going to talk about the Robert Coe's proxies of learning and how we could shift away from them. I'll be talking about the Leadership for Learning group at Cambridge and the idea of a moral purpose. The Learning Without Limits series of books, and I'm going to look at growth mindset, leadership as pedagogy, and the importance of risk. Then I'm going to roll back to Dylan Wiliam's ideas about formative assessment as a leadership model, and his use of this book called Switch by the Heath brothers, directing the rider, motivating the elephant, and shaping the path. Okay, so I've cut away a lot of the leadership theory just to really zoom in. Okay, so let's remind ourselves, this is Robert Coe's poor proxies for learning. They're what a lot of people think good learning looks like, where students are busy, they're engaged, there's a lot of attention, there's a calm atmosphere, everything is covered, and people are getting things correct. These are really good ideas for what stereotypical kind of folk notion of education might be. And why they're poor proxies is because what isn't happening is an assessment of whether students are actually learning or not. And we see the importance of assessment in the last podcast, and we see it as central to understanding how we can evaluate something as good learning or not. These kind of folk notions or proxies of learning, I would group them under ideas of, like, for me, in my 10 years of experience in teaching, what I think is often, teachers are very spectated, very aware of how they're perceived people, the actual, spectatorship of observation really causes a great deal of anxiety, and certain ideas are kind of accepted as codes for being a good teacher. And they are behavior and compliance. Okay, so I would say both for the teachers, behavior and compliance with leadership, but also with their students' behavior and compliance with what the teacher wants. That is often seen as a code for a good teacher. Performance in the classroom, and kind of that's a kind of extension of compliance, what students are doing, getting things right, etc. Exam results, attainment is sometimes seen as a way of determining whether someone is a good teacher or not. We have the problem of things like the coverage of the curriculum and the provision of revision as another code or proxy for good learning. And the idea that students are giving good answers are all, this is the way I would group, sort of reposition Coe's ideas, kind of mythologies that we really deeply buy into. There are implications here for hiring, but there are implications here for learning walks and what is it that we think is good learning and why. Whereas what we should really be focused on, and I've tried to argue in these podcasts, are three things to determine the learning culture. And maybe they can really be summed up to pedagogy, curriculum, and assessment. That's how we're going to, instead of evaluating the single teacher, maybe the learning of the school as a whole. And then what I would argue to really pare down, okay, well, the number one thing that we can have the greatest impact to improve is classroom practice. And the way we're going to do that is through a pedagogy, because we need one, and that's going to be formative assessment. And teachers need to understand and buy into and experiment with the theory and the practice. So here we have the movement from a kind of proxy and folk knowledge into what should be the vision of teaching in a school. Now, as I said, there is tons and tons written about leadership. And we could talk about that. And we could talk about leadership in war and how that then became leadership in business, and how then leadership in business to organizations and education is a kind of sub-branch of that. And there's a lot of problems with this gargantuan set of theories. And I would kind of summarize them to this, that leadership without a moral purpose is completely empty. So if the theory is, how do I get people to follow me to any goal, anything, that's a different kind of proposition to me than I have a very important thing that I feel we should do and is the morally just thing to do. How do I rally people towards that? I think determining the moral purpose of what you're doing is the most important thing when thinking about leadership. Then when you're motivating people or leading them, what we need to think about is, how do we change habits? How do we motivate people? And again, let's go back to Dylan Wiliam's idea. How do we become the bridge? Well, what are we bridging between? What is the moral purpose? Well, the moral purpose is to become the best possible teacher that we can be. What are we dealing with? Well, in schools, there are a lot of restricted professionals. And these are people that feel that teaching is an entirely intuitive activity, that their perspective is based on their limited to the classroom itself. They are not interested in looking beyond that scope of the classroom very much, and they want freedom within the classroom to do what it is that they want to do. That is the restricted professional, and that is in contrast. This is Hoyle with the extended professional. This is a picture, by the way, from the conceptual artist Yoko Ono. I was looking at a picture of her with my wife, and I was just remarking about how amazing she is and how much racist kind of aggression she got into for falling in love with John Lennon and for him falling in love. And there's a story about this work was at a show in London, I believe. And in the middle of this art show, John Lennon actually just climbed the ladder and went to the top. And when he got to the top and he looked at what was written on the ceiling, he saw the word yes. And he remarked that once he got to the top and saw it, he had to meet the artist. He was so drawn. And it was this idea, this affirmation, this yes. And if he got to the top and said no, he would want nothing to do with the person. But I love that story. I don't even know if that story is true. The work is real. This idea of yes, I think is just articulating to me what the contrast is with the restricted professional. The extended professional is yes. The extended professional, teaching is a rational, not intuitive activity that we can improve our practice through continuous reading, professional development, experimentation, that we work with others, not on our own, and that what we do in the classroom isn't autonomous, but is part of a bigger whole. This comes from Hoyle, 2008. I found it through the Leadership for Learning scholars at Cambridge. I think this is really powerful because once you have a community of extended professionals, what you have is a much easier way to improve the learning overall. And then the job of the leader is to bridge us all to this way of being. Well, how do we do that? How do we do that? Well, one way we do that, now shifting to the Learning Without Limits group and going back to this idea, this fundamental idea of Dweck's about growth mindset. Growth mindset isn't about the students, it's about everyone, every single person. And let me take you back to this series of books, the Learning Without Limits scholars. The argument one of the arguments they make in this first book is leaders have to believe in the transformability and the potential for transforming learning capacity for everyone, students and teachers alike. And that has to be a fundamental part of the learning culture. And again, going back to leadership, I would argue that this begins with leaders themselves checking where they are in their own transformability, in the areas that they need to adapt and transform to. So let's just continue. In the second book, they talk about creating that culture. And I would say that leadership here is itself a form of pedagogy. So what they argue in the second book is, now that they've kind of defined what it is to learn without limits, a growth mindset, now they look at, and I'll just read here, create the conditions of growth of a school-wide culture of learning which support everybody's learning and foster developments in thinking and practice within the teaching team individually and collectively. So notice what we want for our students in the classroom, now we bring to the culture as a whole. Our teachers, what is preventing teachers from being this way? Well, teachers are, this second book in this series argues, they have this desire for uniformity and for everybody doing the same thing. Compliance. You tell me what we should do and I will do it. You give me the box and I will tick it. Now, I think that, listen, that should not be confused with leaders having a clear vision. Compliance is something quite different. Compliance is doing what you are told. And with a complex activity like teaching, compliance is dangerous because it can only get you so far. Teachers are fearful and blame-filled and fearful of blame, and that we all have a fear of failure. Those things that students have, we too have. Well, what do we need to move to? We need to move to a culture of openness and generosity, of inventiveness, empathy and support, the emotional stability within us to take risks. So how are leaders going to create that culture? That should be a fundamental, as opposed to what I would argue a lot of leadership models aim at, is towards compliance with certain directives from the center. And if high uniformity and compliance was seen, the presumption is that progress would be made. In contrast, creating a culture is something very different and much more complex and requires much more of the teacher's vision of how to get a community of restricted, resistant people to do what you see as possibly the better thing to do. I'm trying to imagine I had a vision of my year 10 class, and what I'm doing within that class, the leader is doing at the whole school level or the department level. So, thus, again, teachers are leaders within their own classroom. Leadership is itself a kind of pedagogy because you are trying to motivate and teach your community or facilitate the teaching of your community. In the third book, which focuses specifically on assessment for learning, there is this notion of when we begin with pedagogy curriculum assessment through collaboration, professional learning, and inquiry, and having trust leaders actively listen, being visible, acting as coaches and caring for the community to facilitate that middle sphere. This is how we see assessment for learning and learning itself improving. Again, learning without limits. What Alison Peacock argues in this book is risks need to be taken and trust needs to be real for this to actually occur. This is really difficult. This is really difficult because risk implies failure. Trust is a really much harder, more difficult thing to exist in a school than we ever admit, and that it's relational and that it's something we are constantly having to work on and foster to facilitate extending beyond our limits is truly, truly hard. And it is the empathy required for leadership and for teaching to constantly get to motivate people further. So now I want to go into Dylan Wiliam's shift of the theory and practice of formative assessment. We're very familiar now with these 5 criteria and the grid of where the learner is going, where the learner is now, and how to get there, crossed with the teacher, the peer, and the student. In this book, Dylan Wiliam transforms this as a model for leadership. So if you notice on the left, everything's the same, but on the left-hand grid, instead of the teacher, we have the leader, and instead of the student, we have the teacher. And I think this is a very understated part of what he discusses. Maybe he doesn't feel it's fully formed, or, he's not a leadership kind of theorist or known as it. But I think the book is absolutely excellent. It should be looked at, and this is a fantastic model for us to think about. So what does this mean? Okay, well, let's begin with clarifying and sharing and understanding learning intentions. Well, what this means is learning intentions and success criteria. If we don't know, whoever that is, the leadership, the department level, if we don't know what good teaching looks like, if we're caught up in proxies or distractors, how can we improve teachers? We need definitions. And these definitions need to be kind of the learning intentions, the agreed standard, not to encourage a kind of notion of compliance, but a progression model, a notion of where we are and where we're trying to go to. And success criteria act as a kind of form of measurement and shared language for teachers. For teachers, yes, I was going to say students, but in this context, it's teachers, to understand what it is that they're doing. Okay, let's look at number 2, eliciting evidence of learning. Well, what is evidence? Evidence can be, for leaders, it can be learning walks, book looks, deep dives, horrible language. What happens when we do these activities? What we've talked about in earlier podcasts is Dylan Wiliam's notion of moving from an evaluative step to an interpretive step. What do we interpret in what we're seeing? How do we adapt what we're doing to get what we want? It's not about evaluation, it's about interpretation. And what that means is, what we do in the classroom is we measure randomly, and we're responsive, and we can be quite quickly responsive in a classroom setting. From a leadership standpoint, it's going to be a much slower kind of cycle of assessment. So think about the medium term or the long term. But maybe you should think about things being random. Randomness is difficult, just like in the classroom. It's going to require relational trust and assuredness of that staff aren't going to be evaluated or picked on based on what they see. Very specific things need to be looked for, and leaders need to be responsive in discussing strategies that are working and not working. What we can look at is observation, books, student interviews, and what we need to do in addition to creating a culture of better relational trust is Jim Knight's idea of having better, challenging discussions that aren't just punitive, but that are honest, straight, and critical in terms of improving practice. Now, look how important it is. We cannot have a better discussion if we don't know what good teaching looks like, because if we don't have a relationship, that's why it all begins with that first one. When we have a vision for what we want, we see how we are not getting it, and then we act on that. Well, what do? We provide feedback. Okay, what is feedback? Feedback requires what I'm describing as relational trust. A good coach or a good teacher knows that feedback cannot just overwhelm the student. Here, the student is the teacher. We need to know when to be critical. We need to know when to be supportive. We have to trust our leaders. And just like questioning, feedback needs to cause thinking and encourage a growth mindset that we can all get there. And I would go further to say that feedback is a skill that requires thought, and it needs to be taught. It needs to be practiced. And it's all about motivating people to improve. Leaders need to, once we know what we have, once we know where we're going, and we get some evidence of where we are, we have to very carefully think about how we're going to feed back and in what way to encourage growth. In terms of peers, what do we need to do? We need to encourage, once we're starting to train what we think is good, we need to get peers to also learn that, and then to look at one another and to give that peer support to help push on teachers in their learning. This is really problematic for some leaders because the worry is that if teachers who themselves don't know what's good watch other teachers, what they're reinforcing could be the wrong thing. That's also a worry with peer marking, peer discussion. The leader's job is to check on that peer observation. The leader's job is to reinforce that vision and to ensure there's a kind of triangulation of quality. But ultimately, if you're going to improve a system, you're going to need, just like you're going to improve a classroom, you're going to need to improve the peer-to-peer basis of that as well. And then, of course, the fifth one, ultimately, if we want people to improve, if we want students to improve, we want teachers to improve, they need to feel they're motivated by themselves, and the moral imperative of improvement. So this is a model using formative assessment as a leadership model, which I think is very interesting, and I would strongly encourage all teachers and leaders to look at it. Wiliam also uses this metaphor from a book. I haven't read the book Switch by the Heath brothers, and about change, and they talk about this metaphor of the elephant and the rider, and the rider is a rational guide who tires easily, and the elephant's a very powerful creature, obviously, and there comes moments where the elephant's will, if the elephant isn't obeying, it doesn't matter the strength of the rider, it's going to get out of control. So there's this delicate balance between the direction of the rider and the ability to keep the elephant motivated. And they add this third variable, which is shaping the path. That to control the rider even easier, we create a path for the elephant to follow. I mean, of all the theory I cut away from, this one I really like. And I'm just going to briefly walk you through how Wiliam uses it. I'm not going to go through every inch of it. But what he says is when we direct the rider, what we're trying to do is always celebrate wins, the bright spots. We script the critical moves. The job of the rider is to note where the main moments are. Formative assessment, if that is the one that you buy into, the key things that we want to happen, and that we know where we're going. That's the job of the rider. When we're motivating the elephant, we need to have very clear vision, the moral imperative of what we're doing. We need to feel that instead of, oh my God, we have to completely transform what we're doing, we have to make the change the tiniest little step, and then the tiniest little step. And we shrink the change to keep things moving. You don't go with a model of attack and aggression and, getting rid of teachers or getting rid of people you don't like. You go with a model of you grow your people. What Dylan Wiliam elsewhere talks about, love the one you're with. It's just easier. It's part of the requirement of creating a culture of learning, of having better discussions, of facing the idea that everyone can improve. It's part of the culture. It's part of the job of leaders to push themselves to get in that headset of believing in your people, and also training and making sure that you can grow them in their capacity. And to shape the path, what we have to do is we have to tweak the environment, build habits, and rally the herd to make sure that we're all going in the same direction. These are leadership models. And then in this section of the book, he says something really, I think, that all leaders should think about, is that we're all on this journey together. And when experienced teachers talk about the mistakes they made, thus normalizing the idea of taking risks, this creates an ethos about the importance of experimentation. I think, myself as head of department, this was kind of haunting for me. It's sometimes hard to admit when you're wrong. It's sometimes hard to admit when you messed up. It's sometimes hard to admit when something you've tried hasn't worked. But if you want people to take risks, if you want to feel that failure is a kind of normalized state for your students, you need to make that feel the same way for those people who you're working with. That risk involves failure. This job, teaching, involves failure. It is central to what we're doing. And to get real gains, we have to get okay with that, and that we have to defeat that and move beyond that. That's our job as teachers and leaders, to motivate others to move on from that failure, and that to understand that we can't be great without having failure, and risk is an important part of that, and changing your habits is risky. So now William kind of consolidates all this into a model for teacher learning. He spends a lot of time, which I'm not going to do, talking about how evaluating teachers is a complete waste of time. He looks at Bill Gates Foundation, spent millions on this is an obsession of the free market to determine who is good and who. He said, look, it's just a waste of time. It's just going to be such a problematic idea. A much better way, if I could just cut to the chase, is get into this headset, improve everyone. CPD isn't for your teachers who are deficient. CPD, or teacher improvement, is about you first. You, whoever you are, first. And the idea that everyone needs to improve, that has to be modeled from the top all the way down. And that notion is how you're going to improve the learning culture. He says you need content, then process. You need to figure out what it is that you're doing, then figure out the process. So, of course, for him, he's made the argument. I've tried to echo it, formative assessment. The process, teaching and learning communities. If you want to look that up, you can go to the book. If you're at my school, you understand that we've started that journey. You can look at what it is that he's trying to do. Content. Okay, what is it that we want teachers to change? It needs to have some basis in evidence. It can't just be intuitive. It needs to not only have evidence, but strategies and techniques that teachers can use. And then how do they change? Well, they're going to change by choosing to participate or not. And he makes a point of saying that, I just have the book open here. The idea that teachers should choose for themselves what to develop is one of the most challenging things for leaders to accept. And it's really hard because we think we know the best and we want everyone to participate. But William argues that the way that real change occurs is when teachers choose to participate or not. And he talks about theory X and theory Y, that, theory X, this is from Douglas McGregor in 1960. Theory X is that people can't be trusted and they need to be managed constantly to check that they're doing what they should be doing. In contrast, theory Y holds that people want to do a good job and that the job of the manager is to create the conditions in which people can get on with doing just that. Now, it is important to note that theory X isn't always wrong and theory Y isn't always right, but theory Y is in general a more productive initial assumption. I think that's a really hard and difficult thing to accept, and that presuming the best in people doesn't mean laissez-faire and letting them be. We have to think about shaping the path, motivating the elephant, but that we give choice and that we ourselves model that change is really crucial. I'd say I would echo him. I think that's probably going to be the biggest and most challenging thing for a leader to accept. This isn't whatever you may think about these podcasts or my own thinking. This is not a dogma. This is not a kind of orthodoxy. Teachers need to be able to make these ideas their own and adapt them to themselves. Now, you have to be careful. Why the theory is so important is some adaptations can lead to misapplications, and that's why you have a community. But when teachers make these things their own, that's when they really start to take off. Like we said, small steps. Nobody can fully change teaching practice in one shot. It has to be small. I'm going to take you to the last two, which are the most important. And he says they're two sides of the same coin: accountability and support. What he calls supportive accountability. Okay, and I'm going to just take you to the end. What we need from teachers to have an effective learning school is a commitment to the continual improvement of practice and a focus on the things that make a difference to students. Okay, not intuitive, not your own personal bias, but the things that we can demonstrate has the greatest significance to learning. What leaders need to do is a commitment to having effective learning environments for teachers. That means expectations of continued improving practice, keeping the focus on the things that make a difference to students, providing time, space, and dispensation and support for innovation, and supporting risk-taking. Now, what this means, in addition to having a clear vision and to providing time and to dropping away things that don't help, is a dialogic and reciprocal relationship between teachers and leaders to have a supportive but accountable system for constant improvement of practice. If we could build that in the school, in any school, we are going to have a learning culture that ensures that we will move to the next level, which is improving learning practice. So we've talked today about using formative assessment as a leadership model. We've looked at Dylan Wiliam's work. We've looked at the Leadership for Learning group in Cambridge, which I'd strongly urge you to look at, or the Learning Without Limits group, and the series of books that they've put out on the idea of growth mindset and being able to improve. That very idea. What I want you to end with is just these challenges. Okay, let's go back to Napoleon and Socrates. I want you to think about wherever you are in your leadership journey, whether you're a teacher, department level, or senior leader, or head teacher. I want you to think about this. Okay, how are you going to model your own learning and your engagement with the theory and research to those around you? Where and how can you make teaching and learning a priority? How can you where in your practice, in your leadership, can you lift its priority to model that for the community as a whole? And most importantly, and most difficult, is this question: what are things that you could stop doing? Not because they're not good. Everything we do is good, okay? But some things we're doing are not as good as other things. Where are those things? What are those things? How can we identify them? And how can we change them? How can we stop doing some things to make space for other things? And then how can we make that vision clear for those of us, so to all those people that we lead? How can we model it? How can we get that clarity? And how can we trim away the fat to get a stronger vision of improving learning? So this is probably, I think, going to be the last of the podcasts. I think that I wanted to do one on learning science, but I don't think it's as crucial. I'm going to upload this now, and I'm going to send it to some people. But what I'm going to say to you is, what I would say is, we should, at the end, when you've come to the end, if you've actually come to the end, you should stop and you should start again. And start thinking about putting all of these things together into a means of improving your own practice. And what I'm doing is I'm compiling my notes and creating a series of worksheets and work reflections on how you can apply these ideas into your own practice, into your own department, into your own school. But what's crucial to this are these lectures or these webinars or whatever you want to call them, podcasts. I think they're webinars. And to think about how you can apply this practice to your own. I hope they've helped you, and I hope to hear from you soon.